Well, Dr. Kate Balestrieri, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, as of we. When I was doing some research of trying to understand where we should start, I wanted to start with sort of misconceptions around sex therapy. Um, so specifically, what is the biggest misconception you have had around, or I guess, what's the biggest misconception around sex therapy to start?
Yeah, I think that the biggest misconception that I hear frequently about sex therapy is that a lot of folks mistakenly believe that sex therapists are sexual with their clients, and we are not. Sex therapy is talk therapy, but it really focuses on developing insight and excuse me, skills and education and processing, emotional processing and understanding around sexuality. So there's
Mm.
no touch involved ever.
That's, I mean, it's funny as a British guy hearing that because I don't think in England we're really prudish and awkward and reserved. So
Uh-huh.
to assume we're going to sex therapy and the sex therapist is going to get involved in some way, male or female, I think might be a bit maybe a cultural um shift there. I don't know. Maybe I'm just
Maybe.
particularly prude. Okay, that's interesting. So I have heard that there is I'm probably getting the term wrong, but triadic models of
Mhm.
therapy. Could you explain what that is and what that actually looks like in practice?
Of course, yeah. So sex therapists will often work with surrogate partner therapists and clients in what's called a triadic model. So it's triadic because there are two professionals and a client, and they sort of work in tangent together. And the surrogate partner therapist does engage in touch and sometimes sex with the client. And then the sex therapist engages in a lot of the deeper emotional processing. So both the sex therapist and the surrogate partner therapist are in communication after every session, so the client is really, really well supported. And this can be really beneficial for folks who are struggling with all kinds of sexual concerns and may not have a partner or may not have a partner who wants to participate in the resolution.
Okay. The one of my favorite books is a book called Fallen Leaves by a guy called Will Durant, who summarized all of human history. But he said in one very, very small chapter on sex that it's the very essence of life and it shouldn't be ignored. And coming from this sort of historian academic, I was like, oh, didn't expect that. So it's super important, but it's super complicated and people don't talk about it. And it's very layered. With, and as a result, I feel like your lens through humanity is a really interesting one. Um, so throughout your career as a sex therapist, what's surprised you specifically about women the most?
About women in sex or women in general?
Women in general.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, that's such a good question. What has surprised me the most? Mm, This might sound like a criticism, and I don't mean for it to be one. So it's more of an acknowledgement of the place that women are often born into and how hard it is to move out of that position. Um, but I think what surprises me most in my work is with women, just how much dissatisfaction and frustration women are willing to tolerate in their relationships. And again, this is one of the ways that women are conditioned to show up in relationships. This is not a biological or innate drive. But when we look at systems of patriarchy and sexism that we've been all enculturated into, um, it blows my mind in one of the most tragic ways ever that women are often go their whole lives without really feeling the extent of sexual pleasure that they are capable of feeling, and that's heartbreaking to me.
There's a sad thought that that's still, I mean, obviously it's still going
Yeah.
on, but I think someone ignorant, perhaps like me, I think it was in 2024, it was maybe it's as best as it's ever been. I don't know. What would you
Yeah.
say? What would you say to that
It's as best it's ever been in terms of what?
in terms of, um, I guess, male and female equality when it comes to sexual pleasure and that
Well,
right to have
no.
pleasure? Okay, but well, tell us why.
Yeah, best it's ever been. That's an interesting question. I would say maybe in some cases, but maybe not. I think we don't really have that data to know if there have been more equitable segments of history where sexual pleasure has been equally prioritized and experienced. At least not during patriarchal times. Pre-patriarchy, we have some data that helps us understand that sex was something that was not really so compulsory monogamous, and um, people had just a lot more pleasure in general. So once patriarchy became sort of the norm in most cultures, women's sexuality, female sexuality has taken a back seat and has been largely co-opted from both a political and a power movement and also a pleasure movement. So I think, are things getting better? Sure, but we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
The orgasm gap is still showing that women who have sex with men have roughly 30% less orgasms than the men do. And that orgasm gap is staggering when we look at same-sex partnerships in contrast, where there's far more equality around orgasmic pleasure.
Mm. We had the pleasure of having Dr. Ian Kerner on the
Oh, you
podcast a couple
did.
of weeks. We did, yeah. I mean,
Good.
I'm a big fan of his books
Yeah.
and his work in general. And as far as practical message for men of how to bridge that orgasm gap a bit, I implore
Hmm.
everyone to check out Dr. Kerner's work. What
Hmm.
would what I guess is it more on the sort of practical side of things, specific with sort of how to foster more foreplay and creating space for couples to actually get intimate and allow time for various different mismatched libidos to get up to speed and things. But um, what practical, I guess, takeaways would you suggest to society? I guess because it's a societal problem you're touching on,
Yeah.
to help solve that issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question because, and I want to acknowledge that when I talk about sexism and misogyny, many men immediately get their shackles up and they think that this is a direct attack on them, and it's not. We are all born into this system, so it requires a collaborative approach to understanding sort of the depth in which patriarchy has affected the way we all show up in relationships romantically and sexually. Um, I think a lot of men have such good intentions of creating pleasure potential with their partners, but a lot of them are still doing it unconsciously with a desire to prove something about the kind of lover they are, which indirectly makes that pleasure experience about them and for them. And I think this is where we see a lot of the gap coming about because there are not enough men who are willing to listen to the experiences of women, listen to feedback that women give them. They're still too guarded about what their sexual performance says about them. And that's really getting in the way of women's pleasure being prioritized in an equitable fashion. I think we've also, in casual sex and hookup culture, really denigrated humanity and the humanization of these experiences. So, a lot of the men that I've worked with over the years, a lot of the women I've worked with over the years, have said things like, I don't really have to care about her pleasure. It's just a one and done experience. It doesn't matter. I've got mine. I'm getting mine. And that sort of uh, self focus is really limiting when we look at how we can create experiences of mutuality more effectively. But the other part, and here's where systemic sexism comes into play, is that we are not taught about female anatomy in a way that really optimizes for pleasure. We're taught about female anatomy in terms of menstruation and pregnancy sometimes. A lot of folks don't even get that kind of education. So there are a lot of misunderstandings and misgivings about female anatomy that I don't hear enough men trying to correct. And I've worked
Mm,
with thousands of men at this point.
I'm
So
sure.
they're quite passive in their understanding about female anatomy and female pleasure, and that's just a real bummer.
Yeah.
So I know there are some men out there who are doing this work and they're learning as much as they can. There's always more we can learn. And I would say the best thing that men can do is to stay curious about the partner they're with in real time, because her interests might change from sexual experience to sexual experience if you're with the same partner. So don't make assumptions about what she wants or what's working or not working for her in a moment. Ask, get
Mm,
curious, try new things, get feedback all the time. Um, and if you're with multiple partners, don't assume that because one likes one thing, another person is going to like the same thing. That is evidence of the fungibility, right, that comes with objectifying women, and it's often very unconscious. So I don't think
mm,
most men are sitting in a corner maniacally trying to keep pleasure from women, but it happens because we're conditioned to show up in certain ways.
mm. I mean, it's a prescription to be as educated as you can about things that matter,
Yeah.
right? So I think
Yeah.
bringing that to the conscious, like awareness, I think is a really good
Mhm.
start. Um, and you had a lovely point about about performance, and beginner's mind comes to mind, where
Mhm.
if you, I don't know, you're an accomplished lover, whatever you want to think, or you've been with multiple partners. I think the male ego is a very fragile thing, which can lead you to be like, well, that really made my own ego shine, so
Well,
I'm going to eat. When it feels like, if I am hearing you correctly, what men should do is come up with the lens of, okay, I know nothing, I'm learning a completely new thing here with this partner. I'm not going to assume.
yeah.
Okay, as like a
Yeah.
practical takeaway, just trying to distill on that.
No, I appreciate you bringing it down that way. I think that's really smart, right? And the same for women too. Like, let's not assume that we know exactly what to do. It's fine if you want to bring in things that you've learned from other people, but we just can't make assumptions about what's working for our partner or ourselves in any given moment because we're so dynamic as creatures.
Mm. It seems ridiculous if you were to put it through a lens of conversation, and you're going to have the same, you're going to crack the same jokes all the time and the same stories, and just rinse, wash, and repeat the same conversation with everyone. Well, just
Right.
that would be ridiculous, right? You're not going to get very far. So then why does one apply that logic to their sex life? Who knows?
Yeah.
With so that was the question on what surprised you most about women. What
Mhm.
has surprised you most about men?
Mm, yeah. Well, I think an obvious answer, this is not what's surprising for me, but what I think a lot of folks might want to hear is something like, oh, men are really emotional, vulnerable beings. But I've always known that. So that's not been surprising to me. I think what's been most surprising to me about my work with men is how, oh, how do I say this? Often the internal conflict between wanting to grow and evolve in their relationship, but feeling like they can't because they have to be a man. And their conditioning as men prevents them from, I don't know, not being in the position of power or control all the time, or being emotionally vulnerable first, or feeling like they have to be right a lot of the time, that defensiveness. I think, yeah, I think that's maybe what I'll go with. What surprises me most about men is how fervently they hold on to having to be the person who's right or the person in authority, which creates in relationship, both with their other male friends and family members and with women, family members, friends, lovers. Um, it creates a brittleness in their connection that they often get really angry about. And so I feel like men get very stuck in this position of I want connection, but I also want to demonstrate my masculinity. And these two things don't seem to align sometimes, many of
Hmm.
the times.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
the fragile male ego again. It comes up, right? But the
Well, that's your language for it, yes.
yeah, I mean, well, look, I agree. It's something I think guys should be
Yeah.
conscious of and try to work through, right? If you're ego driven, and I don't know, I think to question that. And like I think males go through evolution, at least I think with my friends and myself, where you realize how much value you're getting out of life through your ego versus actual internal pursuits that aren't anything to do with ego, usually about something outside of yourself, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's very different from an 18-year-old man to a 25-year-old, and I think it's something that keeps evolving. But again, to bring that to awareness, I think is super helpful for sure.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to, I guess the main, so we've done, I guess, what surprised you most about females, what surprised you most about males. Um, what are some of the common reasons couples will come to see?
Yeah, probably the most common reason is there's a discrepancy in their desire. One partner wants more sex than the other partner, and they're having a really hard time getting on the same page. Part of what happens is the more disparate they feel in their desire, then the more shame and avoidance usually happens to kind of sidestep the discomfort of not being on the same page. So a lot of couples will get gridlocked in this place where they are really, really wanting to connect sexually, but they're not able to because of the fear and anxiety now that exists around how frequently is enough? How frequently can I get my partner interested in this? What happens if my partner isn't interested? Is it because of me or the connection we have? Is the sex not good? And, both partners feel tremendous shame often around the role that they play in that. Other reasons they come in, one person is vanilla, one person is more kinky. And again, they want to find alignment. Sometimes one partner is recovering from sexual trauma. And so there's some complications that have come up in their sex life together as a result of that earlier trauma that they're working through and want to be sensitive around. Um, Sometimes they are recovering from infidelity and they want to really strengthen their relationship and work on repair. Sometimes they're looking to open their relationship from one that was once monogamous. So there's a real gamut. Folks come in for all kinds of reasons.
Okay. So if we were to touch on the desire piece,
Hmm.
I think the listener probably knows that it's the stereotype is the male is always the one with the high libido, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's not,
Okay, yeah,
yeah.
we're glad we're on the same page. So I guess practical takeaways, what can couples do to help bridge that gap?
Yeah. Talk about it with non-judgment. And that's the hardest part, right? We infuse a lot of meaning into our sexuality. And excuse me, on good days, that can make it really powerfully connective and really sacred almost and spiritual. But we often infuse it with a lot of meaning that doesn't need to be there at all. And so a lot of the time, folks will interpret a desire discrepancy to mean that my partner doesn't want me anymore. My partner doesn't love me anymore. I'm not enough for my partner, or I'm too much. Right. And we begin to create a vehicle out of sex that now has taken on a life of its own. But it's super important to remember that for a lot of folks, sex is more about stimulation. And some people need an emotional connection for that, and some people don't. So I think we have to just get really curious without judgment and remember that you're both different individuals. And also, desire ebbs and flows throughout the lifespan. It's pretty infrequent that somebody's desire is consistent from the time they're a teenager until they're a time that, when they're 70 or 80, if they live that long. So a lot of people will experience ebbs and flows that are to be expected, especially when we talk about milestone events like becoming pregnant or having a child, when you have a second child, if you have ailing parents or family members that you're caring for. These are life events that take a lot of energy and sometimes require a lot of bodily engagement. And so a lot of folks feel touched out, exhausted, and sex becomes less of a priority. And that is to be expected. I would say that's the norm, not the exception. Um, but again, we don't get adequate sex education in most parts of the world. So I think a lot of people are really caught off guard by that. And they go into relationship expecting that they're just going to have this thriving sex life their whole relationship. And again, I think that's the exception, not the rule, because the more familiarity we develop with partners, the less space there is for erotic tension and desire. So it's an inevitability that your desire together will wane and change periodically if you're in a long-term relationship. So I think it's expected. And when people can talk about it and give each other space and room to creatively problem solve, they can find a path back to that erotic connection that's super hot. But when they get stuck in the whole, like, this means something about us and we must not be working, that can really take them out
Mm. I mean,
in
it's
their
too much
emotional
pressure.
connection as
Loses.
well.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's too much pressure. Sort of, you lose the lightness of it. It should be light.
Yeah.
Too much emphasis, or I don't know, pressure of Valentine's Day or this. It's just, you know, you can get in people's head. You mentioned touched out as a term. What does that mean?
Mhm. Yeah, touched out is a term that is frequently talked about more in like parenting circles, especially for moms. But it's a term that refers to like your body being a source of a lot of nurturance and care needs for other people. So you get really touched out. So think about this is not unique to mothers, but because mothers are often the default parent in the home, it happens more frequently with mothers. Um, you've got one or two or three or however many kids, maybe a dog or a cat. Everybody needs contact from mom to feel secure and throughout the day. And mom's body becomes a main source of her parenting vehicle, right? It's the way you pick up kids to bring them from room to room or give them a bath or snuggle them when you're feeding them or put them down for a nap and lay with them. So the parental expectations of care on a person's body can lead to a lot of overstimulation. And then at the end of the day, when you have a partner who's like, I want access to your body. I want your body to give me some pleasure and need and care and comfort too. A lot of parents and moms especially are just exhausted and they're overstimulated and it wreaks havoc on their desire. Right.
Mm,
And we see this a lot in our practice. So one of the things that we often talk about with folks is what are the two of you doing to collaborate to give this touched out partner and parent a lot more time and space in their day to return to a feeling of being in their own skin in a way that is just for them. And when you can do that, when you really work together to make that happen and take things off of that parent's plate, then that parent can commute back into being an individual. And from an individual, they can come back into being an erotically available partner. But that often takes a lot of work. And what partners don't do well a lot of the time is work together to create that space for that touched out parent.
mm,
They instead get very angry and why don't I get anything from you? And how come you're not meeting my needs? And how come you can't do everything? Why are you tired all the time? All you're doing is staying at home, taking care of the kids. These are common complaints that I hear, and it really devalues that parent's experience, which of course leads to further discrepancies in
mm.
desire.
What I'm learning a lot, but what I'm learning specifically from UK is um, the importance of the right words, the right vernacular. Because I can imagine in a real life
Mhm.
scenario, if, I mean, let's say my partner, she comes home from a long day and, you know, I'm sort of trying to be intimate or whatever it is. And
Mhm.
he uses the word, I'm overwhelmed. Well, I might be like, well, well, I'll just give you a foot rub or a back massage. But you get a very different reaction if you change the vernacular from overwhelmed to I'm touched out. It's like, oh, okay, well, touch isn't the
Yeah.
solution here, you know, space and fostering that. So that seems to come,
Yeah.
but learning that vernacular seems to come through an education, like an appropriate intimacy, sexual education. If there were three topics that you could wave a magic wand and every human in the whole entire world is fluent on these topics to give them a sort of sound sexual education, what would the topics be?
Yeah. The first topic doesn't really have much to do with sex on the surface, but plays a big role in sex. And that would be the topic of emotional labor and understanding the ways that we all do emotional labor in relationships, but also learning to recognize things like inequities and disparities in emotional labor that creep in a lot in relationships so that people can get back on the same page in terms of sharing in a way that feels equitable. Because when there are disparities in emotional labor, that's a really, really, really fast track to killing off any desire that you have in the experience. Because the partner who's doing more emotional labor starts to feel like a parent instead of a partner. And the other partner who's doing an inequitable amount of emotional labor often feels like they're in a one down position. And it's because they're not really showing up fully. So the other person has to take more of the activated role in their dynamic, which creates this sort of imposed one up, one down dynamic that doesn't need to be there. So that is a huge problem in relationships across the board. And I think when people recognize that and they really can talk about it and build a shared reality around how to share emotional and domestic labor, but particularly emotional labor, that frees up a lot of psychic space for them to remain erotically interesting to each other. It's not interesting to be erotic with somebody you perceive as a parent, a mean mommy or a mean daddy, or a child that you have to emotionally caretake for. And unless you're kinky and that's your thing, people are not signing up for erotic stuff in that headspace. So that's number one.
Yeah.
Number two, I would say we don't learn enough about anatomy and bodily functions and what's realistic about hormones and um, arousal and pleasure. I mean, we still have people out there running the myth that a tight vagina is better. It's not. A tight vagina actually means that your partner is not sufficiently aroused. That's a big deal, right?
Mm,
So we have a lot of guys out there who are like bragging that their partner's vaginas are tight, but what they're really saying is, I don't know how to create arousal for my partner.
mm,
And that's a big misstep, right? Like, and I bring this up because we get inadequate education about anatomy and particularly around pleasure and anatomy. So this leads to a lot of uncomfortable sex. It leads to a lot of sex that is unsatisfying for folks and a lot of people who are afraid to talk about it because we put so much value on our performance as lovers and what that means about who we are, especially men. Um, so that's number two. And I would say number three is that we don't talk enough about pleasure equity and how unconsciously we do not prioritize pleasure for other people the way we could prioritize it for ourselves, and vice versa, right? Some people deprioritize their own pleasure and over prioritize other folks' pleasure, and then some folks do the opposite. And a lot of this is rooted in unconscious in group and out group identities that we maintain, sometimes very conscious identities that we maintain, but our relationship with our identity and worthiness around pleasure and rest. And, we don't talk about it enough. So it creates a lot of gaps. And where there are gaps in pleasure, there are going to be disparities in desire and discrepancies in desire
mm.
because we
Well, I
want
mean,
what feels good.
yes, yes, definitely. It's really um this like oblique door into a better sex life and a better sexual education of the way to more intimacy with your partner is actually just to sort of make sure no one's parenting anyone, right? So to get your shit together and you know do the dishes or whatever that thing is, that really unsexy thing, which I guess frees up
Mhm.
cognitive space for
Mhm.
intimacy. Um, and then the
Mhm.
anatomy piece is an interesting one because I know in England growing up, you learn about biology and function, but you don't learn about you know, where the clitoris is and sex and what to
Right.
do with it and what not to do with it. And it's I mean, there's this term, a sex positive household and a non-sex positive household, which I'm sure you're probably
Mhm.
familiar with it, which
Mhm.
inside of black and white, maybe it's gross oversimplification, but you can bracket yourself into a sex positive and a sex sort of negative household where it wasn't really spoken about. No
Mhm.
judgment there, but I imagine even in a sex positive house, you're not, I guess, getting an anatomy lesson as you grow up. So you sort of have to figure it out trial and error. But yeah, I can see a more wider conversation. And then the third point you mentioned, which was, oh, sorry, gone.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just, and the third point you mentioned, which I'm struggling to sort of in my head, I guess, label it as like one sort of topic. So you had the sort of emotional labor, the autonomy, and the emotional equity, was it?
Um, Pleasure equity was the third point I brought up.
Pleasure equity, yes. Okay, so how can couples work to sort of have more pleasure, like I guess, and more equal pleasure equity?
Yeah, well, I think they have to really talk about what pleasure means for them, right? And then a goal that I always have when I'm working with couples or individuals is helping them to recognize what are the breaks that get in the way of their yeses to sex. So, we have Emily Nagoski talks about this so beautifully in her book, Come As You Are. but she talks about what's called the dual control model. So we have things that light us up and accelerate our arousal, and then we have things that shut us down and really, put the wet blanket on any arousal that we might have. So often we have more things that shut us down than we do things that light us up. So we want to really look at removing barriers to our arousal, and that usually frees up enough space for people to be more exploratory in their arousal, which creates fun and pleasure and all kinds of exploration and connection. But when we've got a lot of barriers, that gets in the way. So pleasure equity, from my perspective, starts with looking at what are the barriers here, and what might I be doing that's getting in the way of my partner being able to have a full yes, and how can I help remove some of those obstacles with them? So some of these things are intrapsychic, meaning that it's something somebody's got to work out within themselves. So what I mean by that is, if someone did grow up in a sex negative household, they might feel a lot of shame around even wanting sex or wanting to explore a certain kind of sex. That's really an internal, you know, uh, exploration and process to go through to kind of let go of that shame. But let's say, for example, you're with a partner and you want to try something and they think that thing is gross or bad. And I say that in air quotes, but because I don't recommend yucking someone else's yum, but folks judge all the time. So when we experience that kind of judgment, that can really shut us down sexually and make a partner feel unsafe to explore anything, let alone the thing that they express some curiosity around. So, again, really important to think about, am I being judgmental in what my partner wants? Even if I don't understand it, I don't have to understand it. I don't even have to want it or like it, but can I not judge it? And can we talk about their desires from a place of curiosity? Because when people can slow down a little bit and say things like, well, what is it about that fantasy that you like? What do you want to feel in a fantasy like that? You might be surprised, because what folks are often doing is using fantasy as a vehicle or a metaphor to have an emotional experience or a tactile experience of some kind. And when you can identify what that emotional or tactile experience is, well, then you might have other fantasies or other vehicles of bringing that into your sexual space together. And that can open up a lot of possibilities. But if you're really quick to yuck someone's yum because you don't understand what they're going for, that can create a lot of disconnection. So
Mhm.
again, pleasure equity, starts with curiosity and it starts with removing barriers. But it also looks like recognizing that systemically, some people in the bodies that they're in are not given the same opportunities for rest or for pleasure, or they're desexualized or they're fetishized. And so really looking at how might somebody's identities or the body that they're in be contributing to their experience of worthiness or your beliefs about their worthiness for pleasure.
Mm.
And those are really important barriers to remove when you're talking about pleasure equity, whether you're doing that internal deconstruction or you're working with a partner.
Wow, that's really that's a really valuable takeaway. I mean, a lot of it. I mean, the way I'm sort of internalizing it in my head is, if I've heard you right, is I'm horrible at anything that isn't an analogy. So excuse me for just throwing analogies back at you, but it's almost like there's a car that's trying to go, right? It's got all the gas, but it's got about 3 or 4 different handbrakes on. And the way to release those handbrakes is through curiosity and a safe
Mhm.
space to, I guess, release them, as opposed to just slamming on the accelerator even more. Um,
Mhm.
okay, I think I understand that concept a little bit more than I did, so that's super helpful. Um, you
Yeah.
mentioned you mentioned kinks and sort of, I guess, how some couples have one partner who is really interested in kink and other partners who aren't. What would um what would surprise the audience to hear that is actually quite a common kink that you sort of that comes up in your practice, that most people wouldn't think is very common?
I mean, the foot fetish is the most common fetish. Mm.
Right.
And so that comes up a lot, and a lot of people don't understand it because a lot of folks associate feet with dirt or smelliness or sweat, and so they don't get the appeal. But for a lot of people, feet can be really, really erotic, and It is surprisingly the most common fetish. So there's that. But I think a lot of other kinks that often draw a lot of confusion are kinks that involve like age play dynamics because people will mistakenly assume that somebody is minor attracted if they have a kink for like daddy, dom, little girl dynamics, for example, or with like a mommy big and a little boy little. Um, these dynamics are not about having erotically charged feelings toward minors. They're about capturing an experience of nurturance and play and safety and trust building and care that often can feel really wonderful. And kink in and of itself is not often about penetrative sex. It's about the play and the ritual that sort of goes around that experience. And it's about intimacy building. So I think there's often a lot of misunderstanding about why people like certain kinds of kinks because, again, they're sort of looking at it as this surface level thing and like, oh, wow, if my partner likes this, it must mean that they like that in real life. But that is often not the case.
Mm. So how would you work with a couple who comes to you and one has a very specific kink and I guess fetish that they're into, and I guess they're working with you to try to create a space for that, but it's met with some resistance. How would you go about working with that couple?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to understand is what attachments and meanings do they both have about what they understand about the king? So, for a lot of folks, as I said earlier, they don't understand that kink is a metaphor for an emotional or a tactile experience that someone's trying to have that equates to pleasure for them. So, when we are able to identify what's being projected onto that fantasy or what maybe isn't understood about it, then we can start to back into what are some other creative ways that they can solve this problem together. So, for example, that might look like one partner who likes to be restrained and another partner who doesn't want to restrain them because they have different associations with what it means to incapacitate a human being and restrict their autonomy. A lot of partners who don't understand bondage get really nervous about that, and they don't want to participate in something that might look like abuse in their eyes. So when we can talk about like why this feels empowering for their other partner, what they get out of it, what building trust with their partner around this sort of incapacitated state looks like and why it's meaningful, sometimes they can switch and understand a little bit more around why it might be desired and how it's not actually abusive in the context of a consenting dynamic. Um, they may still not feel like it's something they want to participate in, but understanding that what their partner is going for is trust building and sensory deprivation, they might be able to brainstorm other ways that they can play together. So, for example, maybe they don't want to go into putting their partner into restraints or being restrained, but maybe sort of being swaddled or wrapped in a blanket might create the same sensory experience, but also feel less abusive and more nurturing. So I really help couples try to brainstorm and like get out of their own heads about whatever they're holding on to so they can find a place where they have more in common than they think.
Mm. I imagine that takes a lot of pre-work to even get into your office.
I mean, sometime for me or for them.
For them, right? Because I guess this couple in my head, there's someone leading the charge with this, and there's someone who might be a bit resistant to going. But even the act of coming to see you is one of, I guess, willingness. I imagine, or
Uh-huh.
have I got that? Yeah.
No, sometimes it absolutely requires a lot of willingness. And sometimes couples come in because they've tried everything that they know to try and they've thrown their hands up in the air and they're like, we don't know what else to do. We love each other
Mm.
so much. And this is the one part of our relationship where there is disconnection. And they're in a lot of pain. It's caused a lot of hurt feelings because they can't get on the same page. Not because either person is to blame, but because they really want to be there with each other in these sexual moments. And they don't know how to do that. Something's holding them back.
Mm.
So people come in all states of hopefulness and hopelessness. And it's our job as sex therapists to help them recognize what are the pathways forward, and then also to repair where there's been hurt and rupture.
Definitely. Okay. That's interesting. When it comes to infidelity, why do seemingly happy people, happy in their love life, happy in their relationship, why do those people cheat?
Oh, good question. Um, there are a few reasons that happy people cheat. Um, One, I'll just put it out there, entitlement. And this is often along gendered lines, although not always. But for a lot of the men that I work with, they are really happy in their relationship. They love their partner. They love who she is. They love how she parents their kids. They love how she is with them. And they believe that they should be able to be sexual with other women outside their marriage. And for them, it's not a conflict of interest because of the ways that they have sort of bifurcated their experiences of women. So there's a lot of entitlement. Another reason that people who are happy cheat is because they love their partner and maybe their partner is going through something that is eclipsing their ability to showcase desire or have the sexual relationship that they want. So they know it's temporary. They know they're going to come back together at some point sexually. They don't want to upend the relationship, and they're feeling a tremendous amount of want and longing for a sexual experience that isn't available right now. So that's another reason. Um, Sometimes it's because they want a kind of sexual experience that their partner is really opposed to and or that they feel a lot of shame about, so they don't want to bring it to their partner and risk, quote unquote, contaminating the experience that they have there with their partner in that relationship that is so loving and so great. So a lot of folks cheat from this place of shame because they don't want their partner to know this part of them and judge them and end the relationship. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of reasons.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the sort of the ideal, I mean, I guess ideal is very specific to each couple, but a pretty great sex life within a couple would look like some sort of shared journey of exploration, right? It's a sort of judgment-free
Mhm.
zone. It's all good. It's this joint painting we get to paint on together, right? But I imagine it takes work to get to that place, and often sort of like unsexy work,
Mhm.
right? It's not the act itself; it's everything around it, especially in long-term
Yeah.
relationship. Um, I would love
Especially,
to.
yeah.
Oh, sorry, please go. Go ahead.
No, I was just affirming what you said, especially in long-term relationships. I mean, sexual intimacy often requires a lot more work to create space for it. And I literally do mean space, psychological space, emotional space, and sometimes even physical space, right? Because when you're with the same person all day, every day, especially if you work from home together, or if one of you is at home more often than not, it really does create too much familiarity, and we need a little bit of space in order to create that tension for desire.
Mm. I always like reading about can't remember whose work it is, but where when do you find your partner most attractive? And it's sort of often when you see them as themselves, right? Through the eye of the
Yeah.
third person, right? You see them in their element doing their thing. Um, and
Mhm.
this analogy of an elastic band comes to mind, where you sort of
Mhm.
too much space isn't good, and too much closeness isn't good. You need to sort of titrate that balance, which is hard. It's super hard in a long term relationship, right? And takes work.
Mhm.
When um, am I right in saying you're writing a book at the moment?
Yeah. Well, it's done now, but yes.
Is it done? Is
Mhm.
it out?
Not yet. It comes out in February of
Ah, okay,
2025.
wonderful. So, what compelled you to write the book, and what's it about?
The book is called What Happened to My Sex Life, and it is a conversation about some of the most common themes that I see in my practice um, that really create for women a disconnection between themselves and their sexuality, their desire. So I'll talk about some individual factors, some relational factors, and then really how to get that back, how to reconnect with your own body and with your own desire on your terms.
Okay, nice. Well,
Yeah.
looking forward to getting the book over in the UK, and we'll share the link and everything like that. I always think it's such a
Thank you.
it must be such a daunting task to actually write a book and digest everything you learn, and I imagine it must be pretty hard. Did it take you a while to actually write?
It did. It did. It took me about a year and a half to write. It was a long process. And I'm so grateful to my editors and to my publisher for helping me bring it into fruition because it was sort of a big, ambiguous idea. And it took a little while to find a way to bring the information into an accessible format.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about it coming out. I share a little bit about my own relationship with sex and feeling sexually disconnected from a partner. And I think my hope is that if one person reads it and says, "Wow, okay, I learned something that helps me reconnect with my sex life," then that will be all worth it.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure it will. And you mentioned feeling disconnected with a partner sexually. What advice do you have for someone listening who feels that way? What's something they can do, I guess, this week to try to like bridge that gap again with their partner?
Mhm. Yeah, it's really complicated because it often requires that you have a partner who's willing to engage with you in this conversation and in doing the work to get that connection back. And partners are often at a different place in their understanding of what's going on between the two of them and in their own understanding of what's happening internally. So it can feel really, really challenging to be aligned, even to get some progress in having a conversation together. Because often what I experience with a lot of couples is that one person's ready to solve the problem and the other person's not even ready to address it. So there's a lag. And trying to close that lag and motivate sort of the under motivated or under aware partner can feel like a lot of work for the other partner who's more aware of what's going on or more motivated to resolve the problem. And so here's where those inequities in emotional labor come in, right? You've got
Mm,
one partner who's trying to protect themselves from whatever this might mean. And so they're sort of shut down in the conversation. And then you have the other partner who's working really hard to bring the partnership together and find some resolution. And then that often creates this big wedge for folks who are really just trying to feel connected with each other. Um, so in the book and with couples, one of the things that I often talk about is learning how to reconnect with your own body and your own desires and your own sexuality separate from a partner if they're not willing to do that work just yet. So sometimes that means ending a relationship, depending on what someone's threshold is. But sometimes it means embarking on a path of individual curiosity and sexual exploration to really explore kind of where do you want to go in your own evolution sexually. And that can look like solo sex or finding erotic media that help you explore some things that maybe your partner's not into or willing to talk about just yet or ever. um, so it's really about finding a connection back with yourself and really recognizing what are those barriers for me. Am I burnt out? Am I doing too much emotional labor? Am I not getting enough pleasure? And that's why I'm feeling disconnected. Do I have some previous trauma that maybe I need to re explore and re examine? Am I feeling numb and sort of checked out in life or in general? These are all some of the variables that come into play that create for a lot of women sex as a backseat variable. They're not, they sort of lose their connection to it. And a lot of the time it's because they're losing connection to themselves and to their bodies and to what pleasure in a sexual or non-sexual um, capacity really means.
hmm. That's really that's a lot of food for thought. I imagine all those. I mean, I was going to ask a trauma question just off the back of that, but I
Mhm.
feel it probably wouldn't be because the reason why I'm hesitant to ask it, which might be interesting itself, is because surely trauma is so broad that
Mhm.
it'd be an impossible question apart from, well, I need more specifics. Am I right in saying that?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the question is.
Yeah, good point. Sorry. If I was to ask something of, how would you work with someone who's dealing with some trauma? Would it be trauma specific, or are there sort of general lessons for someone dealing with trauma of how they can get back to I guess, an optimal sort of sex life for them?
Well, you're right. So everyone's experience of trauma is different. The traumatic situations are different, and the way that they are reacting and whatever symptoms might be present are different. Although there are many themes that sort of weave together enough similarities that maybe we can kind of broadly address what you're asking. For a lot of trauma survivors, one of the biggest long-term effects is feeling dissociated or disconnected from their bodies. And that is a safeguard, right? Because when we're experiencing a traumatic situation, especially if it's a sexual or relational trauma, that sort of dissociation in the moment actually protects us from feeling so psychologically overwhelmed or physically overwhelmed from pain or whatever might be happening in the moment. It's a big disconnection that keeps us protected in that moment from complete collapse or from complete devastation. And that's adaptive in the moment, but that trauma experience and that symptom can be long lasting, especially if someone has maybe not done a lot of somatic trauma healing, because our bodies hold memories differently than our conscious mind. So what I often see is folks with any sort of relational or sexual trauma, when they're sexual with partners, they often have a hard time being present in their body. And that is happening for a lot of reasons, but often it is because they're so used to catapulting themselves out of their bodies to stay safe emotionally, that being in their body creates a huge threat of vulnerability. So when I'm working with them, I'm doing a couple of things. One, helping them get more acquainted with being vulnerable in their body, and there are different exercises that I might walk someone through or invite them to do on their own time, and then we come back to process them. But often it's about not feeling comfortable or safe with a partner. And that may or may not have anything to do with the partner, right? Sometimes there are partners who are really loving and really caring and really wonderful, and they're patient and they're doing all the things that you might hope a partner can do. And someone might still be feeling really reactive or dissociated. So it's often a course of like teaching them different things to try and practice to slow down the experience of partnered and embodied touch together so that the partner who has had trauma can get back into their body and take that time to then communicate, what does this feel like? And that somatic practice is often very healing, and can open the doors to pleasurable sex again that feels safe. Um,
Mm.
but if there's a partner who's engaging in something inadvertently, and in rare cases, I shouldn't say rare cases, but in some cases, they are sort of weaponizing someone's trauma against them, that creates further injury, which can exacerbate the symptoms of dissociation or disconnect,
Mm.
especially when we're talking about sexual entitlement or coercion. There's a directly inverse relationship between sexual entitlement and coercion and desire. So the more entitlement or coercive practices there are in a partnership, the less desire the other partner is going to experience. And a lot of partners get stuck in this gridlock.
Mm. Yes, that makes a lot of. I'm pleased I asked because I feel like it's very valuable information, and again, another very practical takeaway for people to actually take home. Um, yeah, I
Mm.
think if anyone, if you're with someone who weaponizes trauma, maybe you should check that. Doesn't sound healthy. I'm not the expert though, but
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
doesn't sound good.
Yeah. But also, it's important to get curious about whether or not you are weaponizing your partner's trauma or creating an environment where inadvertently you're creating more fear or a lack of safety if they don't trust you to hold your own boundaries
Mm,
around.
okay, yeah, that makes more sense. So you might not be doing it consciously, but unconsciously,
Yeah.
well intentioned, perhaps you might
Mhm.
still weaponizing it. Okay, that
Yeah.
it's good, food for thought. Um, would you mind if we do some very quick fire questions? We always do this the last sort of
Yeah.
5, 10.
Let's do it.
Okay, wonderful. What if you had to unlearn?
What have I had to unlearn? Oh gosh. All kinds of patriarchal conditioning about what it means to be a woman and what it doesn't mean.
Okay. Actually, just because a tangent off the back of that, is there any resources or books that you would encourage or suggest to people who would like to go on a similar journey? Perhaps?
Absolutely. Anything written by Kate Mann is an exquisite read. So Down Girl or Entitled. Um, The Patriarchs by Angela Saini is a fantastic read. Um, there's a book, I think it's called The Origins of Patriarchy. I think the author's name is, oh, don't quote me on this, but Nancy Gerda. I can't remember her name. I don't think that's right, but I can send you the link to that.
Okay, cool.
Anything written by Laura Bates is great. And yeah, those are some good starts.
Okay, great. And just, is there anything you're reading at the moment, or, I mean, slightly different genre perhaps, that you'd like to suggest?
Anything that I'm reading right now? What am I reading? Honestly, a lot of my stuff is about gender and power and sex that I read because that's what my next book is about.
Mm.
But I am reading this really fun book right now called Yes, Mistress: Why Men Crave Female Domination. And that's a fun
Oh yeah.
read if you're into kink or you want to learn more about why so many men love doms.
Okay. Yes, mistress. Very good. Well, I mean, we'll put all these in the show notes, and for people to go and choose their own adventure. My shifting gears a little bit. My favorite question, which feel free to interpret however you like, which is what some very curveball question. What uncomfortable truth do you believe that very few people agree with you on?
Oh, wow. I love this question so much. And I have quite a few of those beliefs. So let me think about one. Say it again. What uncomfortable truth do I believe that most people don't believe me on?
Correct. Yeah. They don't agree with you on, perhaps.
Mm. I would say that outside of feminist circles, probably the biggest belief that I have that most people don't agree with me on is that patriarchy is the source of most of our problems globally. Um, and that is a big statement. There's a lot to break down in that. But the way that patriarchy has really co opted the experience of our identities through the construct of gender has led to so much devastation for people of all genders across so many hundreds of generations, and is behind so much of what drives capitalism, racism, ableism, and all of these other oppressive systems in our world right now. And when we really stop to look at the origins of patriarchy, um, and we start to deconstruct that, there's a lot of grief that comes up with understanding how our worldviews have been shaped in such intentionally deceptive ways, that it can be really devastating for people to really, really get that. So a lot of folks are super defended against any deeper learning around that because it really does create a lot of existential fear and a lot of grief, a lot of anger, and a lot of lost time, I think.
Mm. There's the nice line I like, which is the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Which,
Love
it's often, if it's a little bit scary, perhaps you should probably go looking a little bit.
that. Yeah.
Maybe, who knows?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a really good answer. I'm pleased I asked. Do you have a idea or a principle you try to live your life?
Hmm. Yes, I do. I would say that probably one of the things that I hold most dear in this life is the practice of curiosity. I think curiosity is super underrated. And when we remain curious, we are remaining cognitively flexible, which is huge for our long term cognitive growth and strength. But it also keeps us in a place of being relatively non judgmental when we can stay curious and stay open to what it is we don't know. it also keeps us in a place of humility and which balances out the hubris of what we think we know, which is, I think, an important place to stay because the more you learn, the more you realize we don't know a lot. And while we can be certain about some things, the more certain we are about X, the more uncertain we learn we are about Y. So I think staying curious keeps us in community. It keeps us in a state of amenability with one another. It keeps us in a state of giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And when you remove curiosity, you remove a lot of the things that really sew together the fabric of the human experience.
Well, I couldn't put it nearly as well as you just did. So yeah, lovely answer. And I agree. Got to stay curious. Dr. Kate Balestrieri, where can we find you? Where can we keep up to date with your wonderful work?
Thank you. Probably my website is the best place to start, modernintimacy.com. You can also check me out on YouTube at Modern Intimacy or on TikTok or Instagram at Dr. Kate Balestrieri, or my podcast, Get Naked with Dr. Kate.
I was about to say, and the podcast. Yeah, it's really good, and probably will check it out. Well, look, thank you so much again. It was a real pleasure to talk to you, and I learned loads. So thanks.
Thank you.